Leon, much of our topic today was inspired by a commencement address that you delivered recently at Brandeis University. And in this speech, you told the students, quote, "We live in a society inebriated by technology, and happily, even giddily, governed by the values of utility, speed, efficiency, and convenience." You further asserted in this speech that, quote, "The machines to which we have become enslaved, all of them quite astonishing, represent the greatest assault on human attention ever devised. They are the engines of mental and spiritual dispersal, which make us wider only by making us less deep." And remind me afterwards to show you my new iPad mini, by the way, which has changed my life.
I mean, Efshar l'kayim shneihem.
Efshar l'kayim shneihem, good. So on that note, how exactly has the rise of technology, in your view, so negatively impacted the state of the American mind and soul?
Well, I mean, that's obviously a huge question. It's also, in my view, the most urgent question that American society now faces. Us putting aside questions of what our response to evil abroad should be, which is always the most pressing question. But I think that it is always the case with technology that devices are invented and used before they're completely understood and before their implications are thought out. And in the beginning, in the first 15 or 20 years of the life of these devices, there were certain problems that mainly legal people got a hold of, questions of privacy, questions of copyright. But as time went by, people began to understand that the real question is what the impact of these devices will be on consciousness.
Hold it further to your...
On consciousness, on cognition, on we'll call it the self, the heart, the soul. We'll talk about these words later. I think that the first baleful implication or effect of our enslavement to these devices, and I should add, I think there are many wonderful things about them. There's no question about it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't have to belabor the wonderful aspects because that's all you ever hear anyway. The first baleful influence, I think, I would put it this way. In American society right now, the most important question that you can ask about anything is no longer is it true or false, or is it good or evil, or even is it beautiful or ugly, but how does it work? Everything is about how things work. And so an attitude that is appropriate only to technical things, only to technological things, has been expanded and enlarged and imperialistically invaded all sorts of realms where it doesn't belong, You see this most dramatically now in this phenomenon that is called big data. As you know, these devices generate more data all the time, even as we speak, than is almost possible to imagine. And as a consequence of this, we are witnessing a new golden age of the quantification of everything, in which all questions are believed to have quantitative answers. And everybody just looks for numbers. Everybody worships numbers. It's almost a kind of idolatry of numbers. And it's very important to recognize that human life takes place in different realms, and that each of these realms has categories and terms and temporalities peculiar to itself. And it sometimes not only makes no sense, but can actually distort or harm things when you take a category from one realm and allow it to dominate another realm without either justifying that or even recognizing the difference. And the most basic questions in human life do not have quantitative answers. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as you mentioned, like we could talk about the question of human attention, and especially the question of human attention and Jewish identity, because no tradition is more premised on the need for sustained attention than the Jewish tradition. But we can talk about that. But the other thing these devices essentially try to do is abolish time. It's just abolish time. The speed that people have gotten used to is lunatic. Everything has been wildly accelerated. The human heart is expected to work faster than it can, the human mind as well. There is in the preface to Sefer Emunot V'Deyot of Saadia Gaon, there's this wonderful passage where he asks a perfectly logical question. He says, if the Kaddish Baruch Hu wanted us to know the truth about everything, meaning metaphysical truth, cosmological truth, why didn't he just tell us? It's a perfectly good question. But the answer Saadia gives is because if he just told it to us, strictly speaking, we wouldn't know it. What he means by that in our language is that what he would have given us is not knowledge but information. And there is an important distinction to be made between knowledge and information. The internet reduces all knowledge to the status of information. So you can find out my social security number, and you can also Google to see whether God exists, right? It's all information. The difference between knowledge and information is time, or if you want to put it differently, method, meaning that you don't really know something unless you've been through the process of asking the question and inquiring after the answer. And as you study, you learn things that are true or false. You go according to certain methods. And it is, when you abolish time in some deep sense, you abolish knowledge, at least the kind of knowledge that is important to us here. I mean, there is all kind of knowledge that can be quite satisfactorily reduced to information, and it's all nice that we have these time-saving devices and so on. But again, the only thing these time-saving devices do for us is free us from more time-saving devices. I remember many years ago when the fax machine was invented, I was very excited because I would get articles and things quickly, and then it hit me after about 4 months that the problem was that if you increase the speed, you always increase the volume. So basically what happened was, instead of getting something quicker, I had everything there at the same time, which is pointless. If they could figure out a way to increase the speed without increasing the volume, that might be useful. But that never happens, of course. So, and these are changes that actually take place to consciousness. In other words, what people have to understand is that our most fundamental cognitive and mental habits are being altered by these devices that we hold. All of them. And as I said, and a lot of the qualities of mind that these devices are transforming or abolishing are qualities of mind that we actually value and deem to be necessary for our sustenance in our tradition,
Are you, as this impact of the internet has grown, what you're seeing, do you see an obvious depreciation in the quality and depth of young writers and their submissions to the Republic?
Yeah, sure.
Really?
It's not just young writers. I mean, I can read anything, and I can tell you, I can smell Google. I mean, I can smell it. And it's preposterous. It's absolutely preposterous. So yes, absolutely. Moreover, I'm discovering that people don't any longer feel that they need to know things. All they feel they need to know is how to access the knowledge that they might need. So if they need to know something, they go to that thing you have on your lap, and they get it, and they get what they need. And when they're done with it, kiviyachol, they put it back in the full confidence that if they need it again, it'll be there. Whereas knowledge or intellectual development, and this is going to sound so idiotically rudimentary, is about retention. I mean, it's about, that's what personal cultivation, that's what spiritual cultivation is. It's not just accessing and using and retrieving and accessing and using and retrieving. I mean, it's, et cetera. So of course I can see it. There's no question about it. But it's not even just young people. There is, as I say, too much is expected too soon about subjects that are much too hard for this to be possible. And it's something that we have to really begin, and in the Jewish community, we have to begin to examine the impact of digital technology and digital life on Jewish identity. Its impact upon commitment and affiliation, its notion of a community or a pseudo-community, its attitude, the idea that in some ways the physical world is obsolete or redundant, and this problem of human attention. Spiritually, there is nothing more, if you look at some of the greatest books in our tradition, if you look at the Moreh Nevuchim, is essentially can be read, and other things too, as a long, deep study of all the obstacles to attention that are required for the knowledge of truth. Really, it's kind of a study of distractions and mistakes. And there are great, actually I was just reading some the other night, there are great Christian poets in the 17th century who constantly invade against distraction, because the spiritual life requires a certain kind of concentration, and not mysticism. We're not talking about any kind of higher transcendence or identification with the divine, or nothing like that. And in our tradition, when the fundamental spiritual experience, I believe, which is the condition of all the others, is study, right? It's hard to know how you could practice study unless you had not just the habit of sustained attention, but a reverence for sustained attention. And in our culture right now, this is going to require more and more acts of resistance, more and more standpoints for resisting this tech tsunami that distracts everyone and has you working on 15 things at the same time, and et cetera, et cetera. And these are very deep problems that I think Jews, I mean, all Americans, all modern people, I mean, everyone, soon if there are people on Mars, they're going to have these things. But Jews, too, have to think about what is the nature of identity formation, what is the place of intellectual activity and Talmud Torah, if you will, in our tradition among our spiritual priorities. And there is this view, I have friends now who are involved in this big project about putting all of the Jewish tradition up online. All right, no.
And you're not excited about that?
I'm absolutely unexcited about it for this reason. First of all, a lot of it is online. I mean, secondly, I think that, well, the project I have in mind is not just putting it up online, it's wikiing it. So what's happening is everybody can put stuff up. So if somebody sits in his living room and does a translation of a page of the Zohar, up it goes, and that's their translation of the page of the Zohar. Now, of course, that's completely unreliable, and one of the things we depend on is the reliability of our texts, to put it mildly. That's one of the reasons the Tosafists invented themselves, because they experienced the problem of not having that. And so I asked my friend who's doing this, and I said, well, what happens if it's unreliable? He says, well, then you can go online and put it up and say you think it's unreliable. And I said, well, what happens if that is unreliable? I mean, at some point, we have to have some standard for intellectual authority. We have to be able to rely on some kind of authority. And you cannot crowdsource intellectual distinction. You cannot do it. Intellectual distinction is a very meritocratic thing. One of the things that Judaism invented was the charisma of learning. In other words, in our communities, we always had rich people, we always had some politically powerful people, but the people who had authority were always the people who knew the most.
And you're absolutely right. We invented what you call the charisma of scholarship, what I would call, let's say, the scholar as hero.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we also invented, I think, the democratization, not of halakha, but of learning, meaning it was Judaism that came up with the idea that learning, literacy, and learning and access to knowledge was not just for the clerics, and that all of Israel can be an Am Mamlechet Kohanim. So aren't you struck at all by the extraordinary accessibility of knowledge of the Jews listening to shiurim as they go to work?
That's all fine.
And you're not moved by it at all?
I'm not moved in the sense that I find it kind of value neutral. I think that if you look at Jewish history, we have immediately taken advantage of every technological opportunity for harbatzas Torah, if you want to use the traditional thing. So, the first book is published in Gutenberg publishes it in 1462. In 1472, we already have a book.
Right.
Of course, it's about getting it out there, as the Americans say. And, and some technical level, a sugya on a piece of paper is just like a sugya on a Kindle. I mean, either you get it or you don't.
Right. I even have Kaddish on the Kindle, by the way.
Well, okay, I read it quickly.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that this all just seems neutral to me. It doesn't seem that interesting. Unfortunately, what's happening is that too much excitement now pertains to the means and not to the ends, or to the medium and not to the message. So, I mean, I'd be very happy to know that responsibly, reliably, all of the Jewish tradition is online, fine. But the next question I have is, okay, great, now what are you going to do with it? The fact that it's been put online doesn't excite me as much as the fact that most Jews wouldn't know what to do with it troubles me. And, and if you don't know what to do with it, you don't know what to do with it on paper or online. You're right that there is this, I don't know that I'd use the word democratization. It is certainly true that we believe that Talmud Torah and that the understanding of certain basic principles of what is true about the universe is incumbent upon every Jew.
Not just the principles, the literacy of text.
Well, we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But the Rambam made the first mitzvah in the Mishnah Torah is basically philosophical knowledge, which means that he expects everybody to have some version of it, which, by the way, is why some of our Straussian friends are deeply incorrect about the Rambam, because a Straussian would never have made that the first mitzvah in his code of law. However, the Rambam also expected everyone to make the utmost exertions, kefiyah choltam, according to their abilities and so on.
Well,
and that's not the same as just putting it out there in democratization.
Well, let me push back on that Rambam point itself, Leon. So you had a poignant piece in the New Republic about the closing of a record store that you loved.
I did.
Melody
I
Records.
did. Zatzal.
Zatzal,
Yes.
yes. My condolences for your loss.
Thank you.
Here's what you wrote. And you wrote about how it could never be replaced by Amazon.com. You wrote as follows. When you search, you're describing a distinction between searching and browsing. So you wrote, when you search, you find what you were looking for. When you browse, you find what you were not looking for. Search corrects your knowledge. Browsing corrects your ignorance. Search narrows, browsing enlarges. It does so by means of accidents, of unexpected adjacencies and improbable associations. True enough. Now, some 800 years, more than 800 years ago, right, there was one genius of a Jew, who may have already come up in our conversation, who decided that there was too much browsing in Jewish learning. Too many Jews weren't able to go through the sea of the Talmud that ranged from tangential topic to tangential topic, halakha, tagada, and back again. And so he decided that he would use his own remarkable mind, itself perhaps the most incredible search engine that Judaism has ever produced,
no question about it,
to compose out of nothing a codification.
Well, not out of nothing. He wanted you to think out of nothing.
Right. Okay. But okay, I couldn't do it.
Right.
I'll just put that out there. It's pretty impressive.
It's deeply impressive.
And he did it without Google. You can't smell Google and to compose a codification for most Jews. And he even is so bold as to say, and this is Maimonides, of course, that I write this code of law, and you now could just read the Torah, and then read the Mishneh Torah. You could just get a codification, and no need to search. And this, of course, that didn't happen.
Well, provoked enormous opposition.
It provoked enormous opposition, but it also inspired. And this was influenced by the land in which he lived. This wasn't happening in Ashkenaz, meaning this is the codification, the urge to codify. Not yet, right? Yeah. He wants to classify, almost taxonomize, etc. And that produces Torah, and that produces Shulchan Aruch. It starts the trend of halachic consolidation. So hasn't much of, on the other hand, all that you're saying is true, but hasn't much of Jewish tradition, intellectual history, also consisted in making information, sugyot, halachot, maskanot, more acceptable to those lacking the time to put in the effort to gain the knowledge?
I'm not arguing for inconvenience, and I'm not an intellectual snob, and I'm obviously not trying to create obstacles to the study of Torah. What I've noticed is, however, that the internet has inculcated certain habits of intellectual speed and superficiality that I find inconsistent with certain kinds of study. If the medium were just neutral about these things, if it were just neutral, if it was just a matter of the surface that you're reading the sugya on, it's fine. I mean, if that's actually not interesting. The problem is that this technology has an influence on consciousness in a way that the technology of the book did not. I'm not being a Luddite. I love books. I understand that in 30 years, everything may be online, and if that's the case, that's where we'll live intellectually. But still, one has to think critically about these things. We always had, search has never been faster or more refined than it is now, but we've had it for centuries. One of our names for search is the Toldos Aaron. I mean, we've had search. The Balei HaTosfos, they unified the Talmud as a text with search. because they were the ones who said, hold on, if you're studying this sugya for, 6 masechtot away, there's something relevant to it. That's search. So we've been collating and unifying and cross-referencing and indexing these things, as you have to, because the Talmud is not organized thematically, to put it mildly, and so on. So I'm not opposed to it in the sense that the more Jewish texts that get put under Jews' noses, the better. What matters to me is whether they'll really study it, and whether the technology will put before them inferior versions or teach them mental habits that are not consistent with ours, not just with the Vilna Gaon standards of study, with any reasonable standard for Talmud Torah. That's what concerns. I'm all for the proliferation. And all Jews always were. We've used every medium that ever was invented. So it may be the case that America is an intensely practical and technologically intoxicated society. And it is certainly the case that we are American Jews and we live in America, and our Judaism and our Jewishness is going to be influenced deeply, take on the coloration of the host culture in which we live. All these are historically true, but I think as an intellectual matter, as a philosophical matter, as a communal matter, it is very important for us to think critically about our host culture. And we'll talk about this today or another time. I'm not one of those people who believes in an identification of Americanism with Judaism. But I think we can talk.
We both love America.
We would both give our lives for America. That's not the issue.
I'm the 10th minister since the American Revolution here, in Shearith Israel.
Well, maybe one day you'll have a rabbi. All these ministers are just. But I think that. But I think that the important thing is for Jews to think critically about their host culture. It's when I've gone around for 25 years, not exactly wasting my time, but it hasn't been a brilliant success, yelling at American Jews about their ignorance of Hebrew. I've been doing this for decades. And one of the things I always hear is that, but this is America, and nobody speaks foreign languages. So I say to them, that's nice, but we have this tradition, and it doesn't take place in English. So we don't use the host culture as an excuse for our failings. At least we shouldn't. So we have to, et cetera, et cetera. Right.
So I want to move from here to another theme in the commencement address. In the speech, and it's related to what you've said thus far, you distinguish between science and scientism.
Yeah.
Science, you say, is a blessing, but scientism is not. It's a curse. So what is the difference between, what is scientism?
Scientism is when you promote science into the only way of answering every question. In other words, science is what scientists do. So, but scientism is an ideology according to which all questions must either be given scientific answers or must be retired as questions. That's scientism. And again, for me, that involves the misapplication of certain criteria of verification and proof that obtain in the physical sciences to the so-called human sciences and to spiritual questions, which I do not believe are scientific. The question of science and metaphysics, of course, is more complicated because, as you said earlier, maybe I should back up for a second. If you wanted to briefly characterize the difference between modern religion and medieval religion, and I include the Jews here, I would characterize it this way. For medieval Jews, for medieval believers, religion was essentially a series of propositions about the universe that were either true or false. That was the foundation. There is a God, there isn't a God, the world was created, matter is eternal, there is providence, there isn't providence, there is reward and punishment, and these, as it were, are kiviyachal factual, meaning these are propositions that I say are either true or false. And what you felt about these propositions was not interesting to anybody, at least as a first order of business. Modern religiosity, modern belief, for many complicated reasons, in modern religion, the truth of a proposition is usually proved by the intensity with which somebody believes it. So we have theologians, Christian and Jewish, who go on and on about fear and trembling and dread and anxiety and ecstasy and bliss, and so that it's more about subjectivity. We're more interested in subjective truth, if you will, but their truth is almost metaphorical. The medievals said no. Now, science is close, in other words, if you believe, as I do, that religion is first and foremost a series of propositions about the universe. Right. So that it makes, it's a funny joke to say that even if God doesn't exist, some things are still treif. But it's not funny in the sense that what that joke does is it erases the role of philosophy in religion. In other words, religion no longer then has to be based upon certain convictions about the universe, right? But if you believe that, so there, science in its relation to metaphysics has always had a place, and some of our greatest metaphysicians have been scientists. And right now, in contemporary science, there are scientists who conclude from their research in physics or in biology that there can't be a God, and there are others who are left with a sense of wonder and awe and feel that there must be a God, which we used to call the cosmological proof for God's existence a long time ago. But so in that case, sure, science is relevant to the foundation. But what worries me is that there are many people, and you can see this everywhere, who, for example, will want to explain the most refined human emotions, either courage or despair or love, who want to explain it in terms of Darwinian biological necessity. And for various reasons that I'm not going to go into here, I reject that analysis because I think it reduces us entirely to our animality. And even if 99.9% of us is animal, that 0.1% is what we mean by the word human. That's what we mean by the word human. But that difference between the 99.9 and the 0.1, for me, is the difference between science and what you call it what you want, the humanities, the human sciences, all the other realms to which quantitative measurement and experimental method and certain kinds of certainty are not applicable.
And the humanities then have their goals addressing not what works or how things work, but rather meaning. Is that right?
Meaning and interpretation. That doesn't mean that anything goes. Again, one of the consequences of scientism is people get used to the idea that unless you can nail something down the way a scientist does, right, you're nowhere, when in fact we can't nail it down that way, but sometimes we can nail it down pretty tight, and more importantly, there are certain questions with which we have to live in a very long and maybe even permanent state of inconclusiveness. It's very important to understand that.
So what happens when religion offers answers to these? Do you see that as competing with the humanities, or do they work?
Oh, no.
I know you've rejected the notion that different spheres of life must work together, but
I think they can work together. They just can't be reduced to one another. And if there are tensions or dissonances, we have to learn to live with them. You see, what I don't want is this. There is this romantic notion of identity abroad in the land, according to which identity essentially has to be one thing, so that all the particulars are kind of sewn together and tied up into one package, or everything adds up. One spirit infuses everything. It's a kind of monism, and it all adds up into this beautiful package which you tie with a ribbon, and that's what you are. I think that even the word identity is imprecise. We have identities. We are many things. All of us are. And when we say that our identity is X or Y, what we're really doing is choosing one of those identities and making it the one by which we wish to be known, which is entirely proper. But we have to learn to live with the tensions and the dissonance. We have to learn to live with things that don't add up.
Though, as we read in the Purim story, life will present us with a choice where we have to decide which identity.
Absolutely, and sometimes the choice, and you make the choice. There are two kinds of choices. There are choices that you can make on grounds that you can, as it were, prove, or in which you have confidence. And sometimes you make, I don't mean this to be melodramatic, but tragic choices, meaning, it's this problem that philosophers after Isaiah Berlin called the incommensurability of values. Sometimes you believe in two values, both of which are valid. So this is not relativism, both of which you think are absolute values, but you have to choose one. So in the debate between, the traditional debate between liberals and conservatives, between freedom and order, right? People who choose freedom over order, a lot of them are not against order. And people who choose order over freedom, a lot of them are not against freedom. Sometimes the choices are tragic because, as you say, a choice has to be made. And not to choose would be a choice also.
America itself is a constant battle and tension between liberty and equality.
All the time, you see. So we negotiate and we manage these dissonances and these tensions. And we have to get used to that, as opposed to, we must not allow anyone to tell us that there is one method that will give us the answers to all the questions, or that there is only one answer to all. And religion doesn't do that, by the way. There are types of Judaism who do that in Jewish law, but you and I both know what's wrong with Das Torah, right?
Unless it's my Torah.
Especially if it's yours.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. But we both know what's wrong with Das Torah,
right.
And we don't think that there is this totalistic system that it's not a machine into which you can put you put your question and it spits out the answer.
Right.
That's not what Jewish law is. That's not what Jewish life is.
Right. Now, so let's push this notion of identity a little bit. Your critique of scientism produced a big debate with Harvard's Steven Pinker in the New Republic.
It did.
And one of the things that he praised about science is that it wasn't bound to the past. It was able to invent new paradigms, in contrast to, here he meant the religion, humanities, etc., which sees itself as part of a tradition. And you wrote the following, which is lovely, and my question is it true? You wrote as follows.
It's not enough for you that it's lovely.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
Contrary to it's not enough to make me happy. The question is it true, right?
Yes.
Contrary to the progressivist caricature, tradition is not the domination of the present by the past. It is the domination of the past by the present. The choice that we make to preserve and to love old things because we have discovered in them resources for contemporary sustenance and up-to-the-minute illumination. That's what you wrote. Now, one of the most moving moments in Kaddish, in your book Kaddish, is your whole book is you're struggling with the question of why are we saying what seems to be a prayer for the dead, but on the other hand makes no mention of the dead. You're struggling with this throughout the whole time in your book. And what you found there, is this fascinating and moving moment in your chronicle, is you discover this idea that Kaddish is not a prayer for the dead. The way you write it is, it's an achievement of the dead, meaning you are your Father, and by you stating your willingness to sanctify God's name or your desire that God's name be sanctified, that is a testimony about who your Father was, because like it or not, you are your Father. And that seems to say in a profound way, and I think this is true for Judaism, and therefore somewhat different than what you're saying about tradition, which is that you're free to, for Judaism, from the moment, and this is really, I think, one of the most either difficult or profound parts of Jewish thought. From the moment you're born, you are invested with this essential part of your identity. You can deny that part of your past, but then in a way you deny a part of yourself. I mean, the most moving aspect of Kaddish is its premise that you don't first investigate whether you should say Kaddish and then you decide to say it. You do it because you feel like you're bound to say Kaddish. Yeah. And then you say, I might as well. Do you see what I'm saying?
Oh, I do. You're saying it's a huge, yes, I do.
So
let me say first, well, first of all, what you said about saying Kaddish is true, but by the way, that's true of most things we do. In other words,
I agree.
The rationalist notion that we take some time out to arrive at the truth and then we go into the world and start practicing, that we take some time out into the world and from the world and find out the truth and then go and start practicing. We're always looking for reasons for things we already do. That's what human life is like. There are many things to say about what you just said, which is a very deep question and problem. Going back to how you started about science, the difference is this. The history of science is a history of mistakes. If you are a contemporary physicist, you do not need to study the history of physics to go about your business. But in philosophy, we are still arguing with Aristotle, and we are still arguing with Plato, because the pastness of something does not automatically disqualify it. Moreover, the nature of the subject is such that these problems have been pondered over for thousands of years. It's a conversation that never ends. And so that's the essential difference. The past, Judaism, there are many things to say. The first is Judaism being a great civilization, and especially Talmudic Judaism, which is what we mean by Judaism, really. It includes everything. I mean, the Talmud has virtually everything in it. It has nourishment for every kind of neshama. It has all kinds of cosmological views and so on. So when we say that we're following the past, we have to be a little more candid and more tough-minded and precise about it. what we're always doing, Jews have always done this, we're preferring, we're emphasizing, we're italicizing one aspect or idea in our tradition over the others. And we give the reasons why they do that. We give the reasons why we do that. That's why, at the same time, there were philosophers and Kabbalists and Talmudists, and there were all sorts of people had, Darkeim Bakodesh. I mean, so in the first place, it's sort of like with the Western canon. During all the canon debates and the culture wars in the 80s, one point that was always lost is that the Western canon is valuable precisely because it doesn't agree with itself. Not everybody in the Western canon is right. If Plato is right, then Marx is wrong, right? If Locke is right, then Heidegger is wrong, and so on.
But halakha is certain universal, meaning certain things are
No, wait. But even in halakha too, I don't have to tell you that there are variations. There is halachic development. Halakha evolves. There are fundamental quarrels, and that leaves aside the whole vast realm of minhag, and so on. So again, we shouldn't. The idea that there's some monolithic, uniform, that doesn't exist. That doesn't exist. We have the same reference points. Moreover, and again, we didn't come to talk about the evolution of halacha, but I've got to give a talk about this on Monday to the Hebrew Academy in Washington. So the kids have asked me I'm talking about some of this subject, and I thought I'm going to talk to them about the famous sentence of the Chassam Sofer, Chadash Asur Min Torah, that the new is forbidden by the Torah, by which, of course, he didn't exactly mean that the new is forbidden by the Torah, but in some way maybe he did. There is a Psuk, which I've always thought, I pondered this for years, you'll remember it. The Psuk is, Ve'achaltem yashan noshan, ve'yashan mipnei chadash totziu. And there you have the complete dialectical relationship of the old and the new. So it begins by saying, it's a bracha, remember? It's a blessing, that you will be blessed so that you will eat from the old for a very long time, meaning that your harvest will be vast and it will not spoil, and you will have access to it, and you can nourish yourself for a very long time, meaning beyond the season in which it was harvested. It's basically almost a kind of metaphor for tradition, right? V'achaltem yashan noshan. And the minute the Pasuk says that, it then turns the screw one more time. And it says, but you will also move the old out for the sake of the new, which is to say, one, that there was once a time when the old was the new, so it makes no sense to disparage the new, because everything old was once new. And secondly, there is this natural dialectical, which is how Jewish law and Judaism has made it to 2014. If we didn't have some essential flexibility, flexibility consistent with our integrity, obviously. No legal system can change in a way that would destroy its integrity.
The applying of eternal principles to new situations.
I would say yes, but I think it's a yes. You could call it that, but sometimes I think that the principles may be eternal, but they're not always as clear as that makes it sound. And so I think that there is. The old and the new is complicated in Judaism. There are these two cliches, these two legends about Judaism that we all indulge in. One is that Judaism has a great genius for the past. So we pioneered in some way in the idea of tradition. We pioneered in some way in the idea of collective memory and in the instruments of collective memory and commemoration, b'chol dor vador ki'ilu hu, and so on, right? The other is that Judaism has this great genius for the future, that we invented the idea of the Mashiach and the idea of the linear teleological view of history and so on. The more I ponder these questions, I have to tell you, and this book about Mashiach that I'm allegedly writing, though he may get here before my book does, but one of the conclusions...
That would make your book even more exciting.
Well, it may, or make it completely redundant,
right,
by the way. It just... I have a friend who says that, years ago, for 10 years, it's been listed that I'm going to write a book on Messianism, and he says that I never had any intention of writing this book, but that it was a philosophical joke about Mashiach that I was making.
You're like the Jew who they hired outside the shtetl
steady
to let
work,
them know,
exactly,
right, when
steady
Mashiach
work.
is coming. Pay's not good, but it's a lifetime
I've come
job,
to the
right?
conclusion that Judaism's real genius, and what's so radical about it, is it's for the present. It's for the present. That there is in Judaism a very, very deep appreciation of the present, that whatever its limitations and imperfection, it's always sufficient for our purposes. There's nothing we have to wait for in order to begin.
But surely it's sufficient because we can connect ourselves to the
But
past.
my
and
point
because we
is,
have hope
yes,
in the future.
but the past, neither the past nor the future, in my view, is ever allowed completely to overwhelm or subsume or to bleed away enough of the present. This is something that I think is completely radical. And by the way, Shechianu v'kimanu v'giyanu was that is one of the reasons that bracha is so interesting, is because it is both cyclical and linear.
Right.
So it is both about the new and about the old. Right. And it's the bracha in which you experience all these elements. So I guess what I'm saying is that the picture is very complicated, and we're not just traditionalists, and we're not just messianists. And the reason we've survived, as I say, is because we have always been able to find adequate meaning in the present. And the most important symbol of that is halacha. Because halacha is law for an imperfect world that needs to be perfected. But it's not law for a perfect world. There is the idea of a hilchata de Mashiach, right? That when the Mashiach comes, we'll all eat chazer again, right? Nothing like that. But there is, halacha is basically, for me, the most powerful symbol of this commitment to the sufficiency of the present. Not to its perfection, but it's
on the contrary, it's the fact that it's imperfect that makes halacha exciting.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly.
So let's push a little bit more on this distinction between religion for feeling good and what's true.
Yeah.
You wrote an essay. There was an article in the New York Times by a Stanford anthropologist. It was a very positive article for the New York Times on prayer, which is actually, I saw, I see something like that. You think,
it's good for business.
Yeah, exactly. Right? You want people to come until we have the Irving Schwartz Beit HaMikdash. They need to come to synagogue. So the anthropologist wrote that as evidence accumulates about the many health benefits of religious practice, prayer is looking better and better. When people use prayer to enhance their real-world selves, they feel good, end quote. So you wrote a piece where you wrote that this anthropologist, quote, never explains how God differs from Pilates here, or why feeling good should be the supreme objective of the soul. This is actually something that Rabbi Soloveichik, Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik, was his supreme critique of American religion. Is that American religion is all too often about how it helps you feel good or happy or safe or can help you prosper, make money, et cetera, et cetera. And really, we both agree here. What should matter is what's true. You and I, as you said, we like the medieval view, capital T truth. So one of the things I struggle with, Leon, is you authored one of the most poignant, insightful books on Jewish liturgy in the modern age. While at the same time, in the book, it's part of its poignancy, is that you openly acknowledge the problems of your own belief in the liturgy that's being obligated here. One of the most interesting passages in Kaddish is when you say that you're having a conversation with a friend, and all of a sudden the friend asks you, how long can you say these words and not mean them? And you respond very honestly. You say, I'm quoting, you say, the question is a good question. There is no point in taking shelter in the multiplicities of meaning. Whatever else it is, the prayer for the restoration of the throne of David in Jerusalem is a prayer for the restoration of the throne of David in Jerusalem. Literal meanings can live without unliteral meanings, but the opposite, you said, is harder to imagine. You can reread it any way you want, but the theology, and here, this is not a changing, evolving tradition. This is a universal, and I hear this, I just say as a rabbi all the time, people say to me, not all the time, people say to me, I pray 3 times a day for the restoration of sacrifices, but I don't want that. And I say to them, I can't wait for that. But that never seems to sway them when I say that.
Yeah, but you want it because you're a Levi.
Of course. Well, that's the maaser.
Right.
And let me just say,
there's something in it for you.
I have not seen 10% of any of my congregants' crops, not once. They've given me nothing. So we'll work on it. And yet, a decade from Kaddish was written over a decade ago.
Yeah, it was.
You're still praying.
Yeah,
So,
that's a very huge question. There's a part of it that I want to talk about later. Let's talk about materialism in a little bit, because it connects to this. But the question of, look, I've never been any good at prayer, ever, for a whole variety of reasons. One of them is that when I feel prayer as a subjective experience, I don't tend to trust my subjective experiences. I don't confer any great authority upon them. People can be made to feel good by all sorts of things. And just because something makes you feel good, as I wrote, doesn't mean it's true. So the rush or the high or the peak experience that people get from prayer, I usually don't get it, and B, if I got it, I wouldn't trust it. I wouldn't trust it because, if you're davening if you're doing Kabbalah Shabbos, as all of us have done at some point in the fields outside Tzfat and the sun is setting, you'd have to be unconscious not to be moved by what you're seeing. But do I know that has anything to do with the truth of what I'm doing? Not necessarily. So I don't trust my subjectivity the way other people do. Secondly, prayer is a commitment. Jewish prayer, the prayer that we have in our Siddur, is a commitment to a belief in a certain philosophical structure of the world. Prayer is an address in the second person singular to a being or an entity whom we implore.
A personal God.
A personal God would be the short
Who
term.
cares what I'm saying?
Exactly.
That is the premise.
That is the premise. At least it's pshat. It's pshat. If that premise is not, if you don't believe in it, or you don't believe in it quite that way, or your belief in it is shaky, or the grounds for your belief are uncertain, or you wish you had some better grounds for it, the grammar of prayer itself can be problematic. The grammar of prayer itself can be problematic, and it is for me. And we'll talk about materialism in a minute. I want to finish this answer first. I regard the Siddur as, how should I put this? Let me back up. I think the shul, like the church, like the mosque, is where philosophy went to find sanctuary. I think that I go to shul because that is where the traditional philosophical questions still mean something to people. That's before we even get to the answers. But the question, I find it much more insulting and demoralizing to be in an environment in which the questions are scorned than to be in one in which I think the answers are wrong. There are worse things than being wrong. One of the things that is worse than being wrong is not dignifying what I regard to be the right questions. So I go to shul partly for that. I go to an Orthodox shul, not out of any devout belief in orthodoxy, about which I have very complicated views, but because for the very simple reason that more of the Jewish tradition is available in an Orthodox shul than in any other shul. For me, it's almost a quantitative thing. If I wanted, when I want to teach my son to admire art, I'm going to take him to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and not to the Akron Museum first, because there is more art in that building. It's just all there. And in an Orthodox shul, the tradition is there. And I want all of it. I want all of it because that's the vocabulary that I inherited. And even my heterodox thoughts I formulate in the vocabulary in which I inherited. It's an old tradition, right? It's an old tradition. So prayer for me is, insofar as it requires this commitment to a certain philosophical structure of the world, is complicated. And for that reason, I have often sought shelter in the spirituality of study. And I'm the first to confess that one of the reasons I believe in the spirituality of study is because I'm no good at the spirituality of prayer. It doesn't give me the satisfactions that it gives other people. And I do believe that study in Judaism, and it's a very extraordinary thing, is not just an intellectual activity, it's a spiritual activity. And you can't understand study in Judaism unless you see that.
Yet you may be remembered through your own study, above and beyond anything else, New Republic, everything else. You may be remembered more for having made one particular prayer more meaningful for Jews than...
Well, I'll tell you, if that's the case, that's fine. I wrote my book primarily to be helpful, first to myself, because I needed help. When I started saying Kaddish...
That was meant as a compliment, by the way.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
No, so I think that what I wanted to... I wrote that book to be useful. First to myself, when I was mourning for my father. I'm now mourning for my mother. When I started saying Kaddish, because my inclination, I'm a very bookish individual, and I'm obviously inclined towards intellectual pursuits of things, I started reading the literature on Kaddish that I could find, and I thought it was abysmal. It always was also, it was all psychological. Everything I found explained how the Jewish customs of mourning anticipated Freud or anticipated Winnicott or anticipated, and I'm thinking, and what if they didn't? I still have to say Kaddish, right? So it can't be, and if I wanted Freud, I could go to Freud. I don't have to go, I don't have to wake up at 6:15 every morning. I'm not interested just in the utilitarian dimensions of things, because therapies come in many forms. And if it's therapy we seek, then, we're living in a therapeutic culture. We don't need religion for that. But I wrote it to be useful to myself and to be useful to other people. And I have to say that even though I was enormously honored and pleased and flattered and delighted by the reception of the ideas in the book, there is still nothing more touching to me than when people come up to me and say that they're an Avelis and that they're reading it. That means the world to me. That means the world to me. But the book is, and the reviews that there were two things that were said about my book that I most treasured. The first one was said by a scholar who, unfortunately, I don't have much respect for, so I have to carry this compliment around like a burden for the rest of my life.
That's the ultimate Jewish problem.
I know.
Complimented by somebody
exactly,
you disrespect.
Exactly. Yeah. He wrote that Kaddish...
That jerk. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Not till he apologizes to me for that compliment.
Right.
He said that Kaddish is not a book about Judaism, it's a book within Judaism. And that meant a lot to me, because it was supposed to be that. And the second one was a review who said that this is a book about prayer by somebody who has many doubts. And I wanted that, because when I wrote Kaddish, there was this, and I don't mean to go on about myself, I'll do one more sentence. When I wrote Kaddish, there was this narrative abroad in the Jewish community that for years I hadn't been to shul and so on, and the prodigal son had come home, right? I had returned. To which my answer always was, I hadn't exactly left, and I've not exactly come back. I mean, in all those years, I devoted myself to the advanced study of Judaism, academically and outside of the academy, and so on. So the plot of Kaddish is not that I saw the error of my ways. The plot was that I am my parents' son, and that my parents expected to have Kaddish said for them, and after everything they gave to me, there was no way that even the most severe metaphysical doubt, even if I thought it was all false and an illusion, there is no way that I would not have honored their wishes. Having said that, when I go to shul and I look at the siddur, I see philosophical problems, in other forms. I see it in other forms. And so what I do is I use the siddur almost as a kind of stimulus to philosophical reflection, even if I find the reflection to be difficult. But that's how I operate. Anyway, that's all I want to say about myself. Ask me something else.
So it seems to me, as you say, the poignancy of Kaddish is that you are your father's son in the book, and you feel obligated. It seems to me then that the great challenge to Judaism in America is not then the internet today or digital world redefining our attention. It's the individualism. It's the notion that you can be whoever you want to be. That for you, the beginning is you're saying this Kaddish no matter what. That is the most Jewish of ideas, it seems to me. And so it seems to me that is the great challenge facing Jews in America today, don't you think?
I think the greatest challenge facing the Jewish community today is Jewish incompetence. Meaning, I think that too many Jews simply lack the competence in their tradition to have any sort of relationship to it. I am much more concerned about the state of Jewish competence than I am about the state of Jewish conviction, partly because you and I and all Americans and all Democrats, small d, believe in the freedom of the mind. All Maimonideans believe in the freedom of the mind. So I will try to teach my son things that I think are true about the world. I have no guarantee that he will choose to believe what I want him to believe, and I will console myself by reflecting on the freedom of his mind. So I can't arrange the philosophical outcome in my child. But what I can do is give him the competence, which is what my parents gave me. So when I went to shul to say Kaddish, the first thing that must be noted is that I knew how to say Kaddish. And moreover, I knew a lot more than that. I'm not bragging about myself, I'm bragging about my parents and my teachers.
You mentioned that you're
Moriva Rabbi Eliach is right here, absolutely. I'm his fault. Yes. It's all his fault. It's just
You should just tell people, you should just tell Steven Pinker to write Rabbi Eliach.
I don't want to trouble Rabbi Eliach with this.
Yeah.
No, so I think competence is what most worries me. I think individualism is part of it, but again, you know, individual and community in Judaism is also a complicated thing. And I think that the single most fundamental fact of spiritual life, of all human spiritual life, is the individuation of the neshama. I think that is the single most fundamental thing, and that's what Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, was also obsessed with, this idea that we are one neshama, and I am not your neshama, and you are not my neshama, and we're not one big neshama. And it's all about the kind of what we do with this solitariness, meaning what we do with it for the development of our neshama, and how we forge bonds with other neshamas, And so I'm not as, I mean, I worry about American individualism. I worry about American materialism much more. For me, and I guess I'll end here, the most important question I have for someone, scientist or humanist, believer or not believer, you know, I don't really care that much about, I don't know, when a person tells me that he or she believes in God, most of the time I don't really know what he or she means anyway. We have to have a long conversation. The line that matters to me is whether or not a person believes that human life, and even natural life, but let's say human life, can be adequately explained by a completely materialist explanation, you see. I'm quite certain that it can't be. And what matters to me, the most important task intellectually for me right now, I think, and this is not just true of believers, is to fight this plague of materialism. I just don't mean commercial materialism, but it is true that there's a certain kind of atheism of indifference. I mean, you know, most Americans, it's not whether they don't know if God exists or not, because most of the time they're just shopping anyway, right? But I'm not talking about that. What I mean is, and if I hear that somebody agrees with me that a materialist explanation does not suffice, and you're on this side of that line, as far as I'm concerned, on this side of that line, there are rationalists, there are logicians, there are mystics, there are Christian fundamentalists. As far as I'm concerned, all of that is a family quarrel. All of that is just a family quarrel among the people who deny the truth of materialism as a doctrine. And that's what matters most to me right now, because the power of materialism in all its forms, biological, economic, evolutionary, commercial, right? That is what I think is driving people away. You can say from the belief, but even just from living philosophically, from living reflectively, from having a worldview, That's what most troubles me.
On that amazing note, I want please join me in thanking our guests for an extraordinary evening.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.